Good afternoon, and welcome to this news event hosted by George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. You'll be hearing from 3 speakers today, and then we'll open the floor for questions during the Q&A period. The Q&A period will be for reporters only, and if you wish to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function, and your line will be unmuted when it is your turn to ask a question. For more information, you can go to bit.ly/new nuclear security report. That's where you can find the report, the news release, and later today, the streaming replay of today's news event. I'll also be dropping a direct link to that shortly here in the chat box window. I'll now turn over to Stephanie Cook, who will be moderating today's news event. Stephanie is the former editor of Nuclear Intelligence Weekly and author of In Mortal Hands, A Cautionary History of Nuclear Energy. And she's also the author of a recent New York Times op-ed entitled The Fantasy of Reviving Nuclear Energy. Stephanie, take it away.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you all for attending this, what I consider a very important event. As most of you know, there's an awful lot of activity and talk around nuclear power, nuclear energy these days. The U.S. is pushing for a tripling of nuclear energy by 2050, saying it's without it we won't be able to reduce emissions to the levels that we needed for to bring the planet under control. And part of this tripling and part of this effort to revive nuclear energy is around the SMR and advanced reactor programs. There's been some good news in that regard, in that TerraPower submitted its design application for its Natrium reactor. And then today we saw an announcement out of Ukraine about a sort of ceremonial beginning of construction on 2 AP300s by Westinghouse. We don't know if this is serious beginning to construction or just sort of symbolic, but there's also been some negative news in the demise of the NuScale UAMPS project. But many countries are involved in this push for SMRs, and Sharon is concerned about some of the risks they pose because of the designs and the fuels they're planning to use on non-proliferation efforts, sabotage, coercion, military operations, as we've seen in Ukraine. And so I'd like to introduce her today and let her talk about what she's discovered in writing this report and what the risks are, the downsides of the SMR advanced reactor push. Sharon, as you all know, is at the research professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs. She served in the State Department, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and the Congressional Research Service, and has focused research on reducing risks from nuclear energy and nuclear weapons at GW. She's also a member of Pugwash. She sits on the boards of the PIR Center, the Wisconsin Project, and the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. And she recently founded or co-founded the Climate Security Initiative. After Sharon speaks, we have 2 other guests, Jane Nakano. Jane is Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and an expert on energy and climate change. Thirdly, and certainly not lastly, but is Dr. Mariana Bujarin, who is senior researcher at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and author of Inheriting the Bomb, The Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine. So let's begin with our first speaker, report author Sharon Squassoni.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Stephanie, for that introduction. Thank you all for joining today, and especially to the Hastings Media Group for arranging this, and to my fellow speakers for contributing to the discussion. So there are many shocking aspects of Russia's war on Ukraine, but one particularly shocking element is the cavalier way in which the Russian military and Russian nuclear industry has treated Ukrainian nuclear power plants in this war. I've written many reports and articles over the years about the proliferation risks of nuclear energy, especially about what significant growth might entail. But I hadn't actually considered the broader national security risks. And in the case of Ukraine, these safe, well-established plants are now potential radioactive tripwires. So when we talk about deploying vast amounts of nuclear energy around the globe, I think you have to ask the question, what if? Nuclear power plants are not designed to operate in a war zone, in extreme climates, or really without very much perturbation in their supporting systems like water, electricity, personnel, and safety, security, and non-proliferation regulations. So this report is really about what risks might arise given the goals of tripling nuclear energy and deploying small modular reactors to do many things in many places. It's not predictive, but hopefully will pique your interest to ask tough questions about not just the benefits of nuclear energy, but also its risks. So let's go to the next slide. If we can get on, there we go. So just a brief outline. I'm going to give you a little bit of context of what I mean when I say new nuclear energy, then talk about specific national security risks, and then how SMRs, small modular reactors, may alter those security risks. So this new nuclear energy future is being proposed. You've seen in the press on the margins of the COP28 in December that the US and 21 countries pledged to triple nuclear energy to mitigate climate change. Well, how exactly would we get there? It's not just the existing nuclear states that would triple. For example, Russia didn't even sign that pledge. And I'm guessing that the US itself is probably going to triple nuclear energy. Maybe China could. But the idea is many new states would need to adopt nuclear energy to make this happen. To do that, reactors would have to be tailored for them. The report outlines why this hasn't happened in the past, mostly for physical reasons, the size of transmission grids, and also financial reasons. So these need to be less expensive, smaller, safer. And finally, nuclear energy would need to expand beyond just making electricity. This isn't exactly necessary to make this happen, but this is how the nuclear industry is marketing itself. And this is a big change from the past. In the past, maybe 10, 15 years ago, the nuclear power narrative was that nuclear was the only low carbon baseload generation. But what's happened in the interim is that renewables have captured such a huge part of the market for electricity generation that nuclear now has to tout its ability to multitask. And these three choices, right? That many new states, we'd have to have new states, there would be new types of reactors and new uses, entail specific national security risks. Next slide. So industry and governments, they're promoting small modular reactors and also technical approaches that allow for wider applications. For example, reactors that operate at higher temperatures for industrial applications. The characteristics of these new characteristics of SMRs are you can site them flexibly, including smaller land requirements. They will have multi-functionality. They won't just produce electricity, but also heat, or maybe they'll produce hydrogen or industrial process heat. And there would be reduced capital investment, which is key for some of these developing countries. Next slide. So what does the IAEA, what's their take, the International Atomic Energy Agency? They put out a report every 2 years, which is basically a handbook. And they have detailed that there are 83 designs worldwide. Well, just 2 of those are operating. One high temperature reactor in China, and then this floating barge reactor in Russia. What do they mean by small? So anything really from 300 megawatts and below. And this contrasts to the typical new reactors that are being built, for example, that KEPCO built in the UAE. These are about 1,000 to 1,400 megawatt reactors. And what do they mean by modular? There are 2 elements of this. One is modular manufacturing. That is, you manufacture most, if not all, of the reactor in a factory, and then you deploy them modularly. So you have to think about almost like Lego pieces, plug and play. Just a footnote, so far, no one has actually achieved this factory style manufacturing. And as far as I know, when we tried it at the Vogel plant, it caused huge problems and actually the bankruptcy of Westinghouse. But there is experience in these portable land-based reactors in the military, the US Army, and from the 1950s. And of course, US and Russian naval reactors are not built on site. I mean, they're built to be portable. Okay, next slide, please. So this is really part 1 of the report, which details sort of what the trends are. It also talks about the 2 specific reactors in China and Russia and why or why not they might be indicative of future developments. Part 2 of the report talks about specific national security risks and gives examples of each. So just for our purposes here, I want to just differentiate between these. So proliferation of nuclear weapons, this is the deliberate misuse of peaceful nuclear material, equipment, technology, or skills to support a nuclear weapons program. Think Iran. Nuclear terrorism are activities that are aimed at creating either radiological or nuclear weapons. Probably it's going to be more on the end of the radiological weapons, dirty bombs, because that's easier. But think about theft or misuse. When I talk about sabotage or coercion, this may be activities aimed at nuclear facilities, but mostly for terrorist purposes, maybe not nuclear terrorist purposes. And then finally, military operations. There are basically 2 kinds. And the report details, our past experience with these. There have been attacks on reactors for counter-proliferation purposes. Think about the Israeli strike on the reactor in Syria that the North Koreans were building for them, or even, the attacks that both Iran and Iraq perpetrated on each other in the 1980s, and US even bombed reactors in Iraq. The second kind of military operation, and this is more recent, is what Russia has done in Ukraine, basically using nuclear power plants as kind of pawns in a war. The last national security risk, this is much less acute, but it is dependence on foreign suppliers. And this is important actually because it shapes thinking. For example, there's a big push since the war in Ukraine for countries to divest themselves from Russian oil and gas because they don't like the dependence. It creates a national security risk. But I argue in the report that this just, that you can still be dependent on nuclear energy and it can create other risks. So this range of national security risks, these are not new, but trends in small modular reactors may make them worse. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, so I for purposes of brevity, I've taken sort of proliferation and nuclear terrorism together here. In a nutshell, there are certain technical elements of SMR designs that could increase risks. So there are SMRs that are based on light water reactor technology. As actually Stephanie mentioned the AP300s in Ukraine. We have a pretty good handle on the proliferation and terrorism risks of those light water reactor designs. The material that is in the reactor is less attractive to terrorists or proliferators because, the plutonium builds up in certain isotopes, makes it less attractive for weapons, not impossible, but less attractive. And then you don't need to reprocess the spent fuel to make your fuel cycle work. And most countries do not do that. The thing is, our non-proliferation regime does not restrict types of reactors. And what we do, and it also doesn't restrict enrichment and reprocessing, which are the two capabilities that can make material for bombs. But what we have done informally is the suppliers have tried to limit the spread of enrichment and reprocessing. So the bottom line, how might a widespread deployment of SMRs affect this? Well, SMRs that are based on light water reactor technology, they don't necessarily raise the risk, but others that use either higher enriched uranium fuel or plutonium do. For example, the Chinese HTR that is operating, that uses 8% U-235 instead of this, standard commercial 5%. Some of those Russian light water reactors use much higher enrichments, 45%. And then, of course, fast reactors that use highly enriched uranium, weapons grade, or plutonium fuel, or have online refueling or reprocessing, will certainly raise proliferation risks. If you're interested in the technical details, I can recommend, many things, but Ed Lyman's 2021 Union of Concerned Scientists report, Advanced Isn't Always Better, does an excellent job of laying out all of those risks. The other thing that how SMRs could change the proliferation and nuclear terrorism equation is that it could increase, widespread deployment could increase the pressure to acquire fuel cycle capabilities among countries. They would also increase opportunities for nuclear terrorism. Think about, the chicken in every pot scenario, right? So, what advocates of SMR say is that you could put these everywhere in hospitals, for district heating, for industrial purposes. So, sprinkled around the country. Okay, let's move on and talk about sabotage, coercion, and military operation. I contend that these risks are much less technology dependent, but the major factors include kind of levels within countries, presence of conflicts, ranging from domestic to international armed conflicts. So there's been a debate, the 1977 protocol additional to the Geneva Conventions banned, and I put this in scare quotes, attacks on hydroelectric and nuclear power plants. But if you read the language, and this is in the report, it's pretty loosely worded. There are loopholes. The other problem is the US and Russia don't actually adhere to this. And in fact, and there are other countries that don't, the US law of war manual actually condones attacks in specific circumstances. And the US opposed a resolution at the IAEA in 1985 that would ban attacks on nuclear power plants, maybe. So my report suggests maybe we should revisit this. Okay, so how would SMR widespread deployment change this? If you had high numbers of reactors and many locations within countries and among countries, you would have more unattractive targets for sabotage, coercion, and military operations. But there is one other element, and I don't address this really fully in the report because I didn't have the time or space, but there are a few projects both in the US and China to develop military reactors small reactors, microreactors for the military's use. So even in forward deployed areas, and one of those is Project Pele. That reactor is supposed to reach operational capacity next year. Those create new targets in conflict. And there are a few studies out there. One is by Alan Cooperman, I think, on the risks of that. All right. I wanted to spend a minute on what's happened in Russia to point out a few things in the next slide. This may be hard to read, but it's in the report. I just want to point out, Russia's actions against Ukraine's nuclear power plants, it's not new. The first time it happened when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. They overtook a small research reactor. And in a funny twist of governance, the Ukrainian regulator revoked the license of the facility. But Ukraine has had many more problems since then, since the 2022 invasion, including missile attacks, drone attacks, power outages, tremendous stress on staff, the loss of staff, they really are working with skeletal crews. And I would suggest to you that it could actually be a lot worse because Russia actually didn't want to destroy any of those reactors. They wanted to preserve the capability primarily to co-opt the electricity, right? So when you think, I know there's a tendency to think, well, that's war. It's happening there. It won't happen here. But I think really we need to think through all the implications. I would say, just make 3 points on that Russian actions demonstrate the erosion of norms of non-attack, the impotence of the International Atomic Energy Agency in such a situation, and that the struggle to meet security and safety requirements in unpredictable situations is really tough. I mean, Ukraine is a very experienced operator of nuclear power plants. And when you think about where nuclear energy might spread, that might not always be the case. So the next slide on foreign dependence, I didn't spend a lot of time in this report, but it's a less acute national security risk. But I think 2 points are in order. Nuclear energy is not an antidote to dependence. It just creates a different kind of dependence. And the lesson of Ukraine is really instructive. And I describe it on page 15 of the report. When Ukraine gained independence from Russia, it had a very erratic supply arrangement with Russia because it had been completely dependent on Russia for its reactors, fuel, up and down the supply chain. It was erratic on both sides, right? The Ukrainians didn't pay, the Russians didn't, turn certain things off. Ukraine's solution back then was to gain more fuel cycle capabilities. This is what they wanted to do. And they wanted the entire fuel cycle except for enrichment because they determined enrichment was just too much of an effort. That ultimately failed. And maybe Mariana knows a little bit more about exactly why. It's kind of in a way a non-proliferation success story. But now they are dependent on US fuel, which as Americans, we think that's a good thing, but not every country is going to view it that way. Okay, we have just a few final points. So this is my kind of crazy quilt slide. On the left, I've summarized some of the characteristics of a widespread SMR deployment and how those feed into the national security risks on the right. They're not all co-equal, right? They don't all affect every element of that. And I want to stress that these are potential factors which are dependent on what actually happens. So it's important to look at the potential plans. So we'll go to the next slide. Back in 2008, which is when I specifically started looking at this seriously, the State Department concluded, when we were all talking about a nuclear renaissance, back in the early 2000s, that the rise in nuclear power worldwide would inevitably increase proliferation risk. And three things have happened since then. First, many more countries are interested in nuclear power than they were, even after Fukushima, right? We had a lull, and now it's increased because of climate change concerns. Small modular reactors were not really in the hopper, so to speak, at that point. They could, if successful, lower the political, technical, and financial barriers to entry into the nuclear field. The second development is Russia is no longer a collaborator in nuclear nonproliferation, and I can give you many examples in many different fora of that. And the third is that governance challenges abound globally and may increase with climate stress. So let's just take a look at the next chart. Okay, it's totally illegible. You'll find this on pages 23 and 24 of the report. All I want to do is highlight three things. One, there are many more states interested in nuclear energy now. This is kind of a compilation of the State Department list of countries plus my own addition. So 30 versus 58 today. Those states are less stable. I've kind of organized them according to the Fragile States Index. And you can find out more about that in the report. These are alert levels for conflict. You could use other indices. This is just a convenient one. And their declared interest in small modular reactors. So 16 have said, yes, sign us up. But the others have, I put in transmission grid size. They have small enough grids that this is the option that makes sense of them. You don't want to overwhelm an electricity generation, a grid with generators that are far too big. That creates another instability. As the report notes, all but two of the countries that Russia has agreements with have alert levels ranging from warning to high alert, and China's partners are similar. So I'm going to wrap up with summary and recommendations. Pretty much, these approaches to reducing carbon emissions really need to consider the national security implications. Our experience, Ukraine's experience, reminds us that these power plants can be sabotaged, used for coercion, even weaponized. The wide-scale introduction of SMRs could increase risks in a variety of different ways, either in the technology they deploy, by lowering the barriers to entry, more countries, potentially with more governance challenges, and more targets for mischief. And lastly, that cooperation among the key supplier states, that's essential to minimize safety, security, and proliferation risks of nuclear energy, is at an all-time low. So I've summarized my recommendations in the following way. Last slide. We need to reinvigorate shared understandings with Russia and China. I know it's difficult. I engage in track 2 talks with them. But these shared understandings are not just of nuclear weapons proliferation, but all the national security risks. We also need to factor all of these risks into nuclear energy export decisions. I think we should commission a new State Department study that looks not just on the proliferation risk, but this wider range of risks. I have a really wonky recommendation, which is to dig deeper into exactly how multinational enrichment plants could reduce proliferation risk. And then finally, we need to prioritize the fastest and most efficient measures to combat climate change. That might not be nuclear energy. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll turn it back to Stephanie.
Sharon, that was a great presentation and should give everyone a lot of food for thought as they do further reporting on the whole nuclear scene. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jane Nakano, who is an expert on energy and climate change at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Jane, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you, Sharon, for the invitation, and congratulations on this report. I wanted to just highlight 2 or 3 sort of topics or sub-themes in this report that I thought were particularly interesting. To someone like me who looks at energy as opposed to sort of a nuclear non-proliferation side of this ecosystem, I think a lot of countries, when they approach energy, I think the choices are often shaped by what they have as a resource, also economics, and also carbon intensity, increasingly so. And I think the report does a really good job in highlighting many of the economic challenges that are associated, not just uniquely to SMR, but nuclear in general. But one of the things that I do keep wondering is how some of this enhanced this decarbonization efforts could really change the economics. Now, obviously, this is slightly chicken and egg question, but as more economies start having carbon pricing, for example, the nuclear use for cogeneration may have very different economic structure. I think right at the moment, countries like Japan tend to use cogeneration nuclear for desalination, mainly because the fossil fuel imports have always been pretty expensive. So that's one of the things that is I'm quite interested in observing in some years to come. The other one is we've been reading quite a bit about this growing energy requirements for these strategic manufacturing, like AI, semiconductor, cryptocurrency mining, etc. And I think it's many of these states, regions, also manufacturers, they all want clean source of electricity that is 24/7. And I think after 3 decades of pretty stagnant power growth in the United States, I think we all are sort of entering this period of new paradigm when we might see this really robust power demand. And I do wonder, I think renewables are extremely important. I just do wonder how the pace and scope of that type of requirements may also change how different utilities look at options. Do we have the right sources, natural resources, or infrastructure in the right places to meet these requirements? And then the second really important sub-theme this report highlights is, in light of this sort of great power competition, what is the space that's viable for more cooperation and collaboration? And I think that's an extremely challenging but important issue. And it's but I guess borrow the exact sort of wording from the report. I think often the China and Russia seem to be really pursuing SMR and then nuclear more broadly, in part to try to reduce U.S. international influence. So to that extent, I'm just not clear, whether the United States has a choice not to continue sort of pursuing SMR. Both for domestic, but then also for international, in the international marketplace, both for national security reasons, because of all these technologies have dual use, but then also for geopolitical influence. For better or worse, I think the US and Saudi Arabia nuclear commerce saga highlights how complicated these things are. The United States wants, its high standard non-proliferation requirements to be agreed by Saudi Arabia if Saudis are to import or benefit from the U.S. technology. But there's quite a bit of reluctance in Riyadh. Obviously, right at the moment, because of what's happening in the region, it's all sort of on pause. But then I think most recently, right before the regional conflict in Middle East, the Saudis hinted at going with the Chinese, sort of trying to see, how much they can get a deal out of Washington, kind of playing the, off, Washington and Beijing, somewhat, leveraging the ongoing great power competition piece. Lastly, I think both in my mind, climate mitigation and nuclear security are both global commons. And increasingly, as Sharon, you pointed out, I think, that it's really hard to collaborate and cooperate. And when it comes to something like this COP28 goal of tripling the capacity, without China, it's just not possible. It's not a realistic goal, right? But I do think that while I think cooperation is the first choice, I think we might need to just prepare for the second option, which is competition. Maybe the competition is the way to drive better practice in nuclear safety or even deploying clean energy resources. But in short, I really, I think often we focus quite a bit about what roles nuclear energy may have in trying to mitigate global climate change. But I think there has been much less studies thus far on what climate could do or may do to nuclear. And I think one of your concluding sections, highlights how some of the sort of resource, related issues, like water security is an increasingly important issue, but then also what climate based sort of international security deterioration may do to the operation of nuclear power plants. And I do think that more studies are needed if we do want to see as many sort of technical or technology choices still remaining viable, whether from the economics perspective, the technology, or even just resource endowment. But these are I really look forward to the discussion and also as well as questions from the audience. Thanks so much.
Stephanie,
You're
please
muted,
unmute yourself.
Stephanie.
Interesting, very interesting comments, and apologies for not unmuting myself. Jane, thank you very much. You've certainly added, layered on layer upon layer of complexities involved with the nuclear scene and climate change. Now I'd like to turn to Dr. Mariana Bujarin, who is at the Harvard's Belfer Center and author of Inheriting the Bomb, The Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine. Mariana, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your kind introduction. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to offer some reflections on this important report. I will focus on some of the aspects touched upon already in the report, but also in Sharon's excellent presentation that have to do with lessons from the war in Ukraine, from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the nuclear risks that it has created. It's quite an unprecedented situation. And let me just say that those lessons are still in the making. The war is still ongoing, and we haven't seen the end of it yet. And there are many, many more things that could go wrong. One of the aspects that seems pertinent to me and relates to Sharon's point about proliferation risks is that the war itself has undermined the system of restraint, nuclear restraint, and the system of nuclear non-proliferation for two reasons. One, Russia has used its nuclear threats abundantly while launching this war, while prosecuting this war, relying on its nuclear deterrent in order to dissuade Ukrainian partners and allies from providing it with aid. It hasn't really succeeded fully, but has affected the timing and the kind of military assistance that Ukraine has been getting. And so, Ukraine is not protected by a nuclear deterrent of its own. It's not protected by a nuclear deterrent extended by an ally. And so this creates the optics that surely the country that isn't a part of the nuclear deterrent system can much more easily fall prey to a nuclear armed state. And the assistance will be limited in the sense that, other partners will be afraid of escalation, absolutely understandably so. And that country would be left sort of to fend for its own in the face of a nuclear armed aggressor. Now, that does not create very good optics for, incentives not to acquire nuclear weapons, and so might add to pressures for countries like Ukraine who are not protected by extended deterrence to try and seek a deterrent of their own. To add to this, Ukraine's own nuclear history adds to this really regrettable optics because, of course, Ukraine was an inheritor of a large nuclear capability and certainly a nuclear option after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and decided to be on the good side of history and do the right thing and disarm and join the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1994. And so, hopefully the lesson of this conflict is not let no good deed go unpunished, and kind of parlaying the value of nuclear weapons to those who might find themselves in a similar security predicament as Ukraine. So against this unfortunate kind of pressures, possible pressures, long-term pressures to proliferate, we have this war and the very palpable nuclear risks that were created by Russian invasion. In particular here, we talk about risk created to a rather highly nuclearized country. So 50% of Ukraine's energy mix comes from nuclear. This war highlighted the need to really rethink, which, this report is a first step in doing, the intersection between nuclear security, electrical grid security, and national security in a large-scale conventional conflict. Now, grid, as we have seen, comes under attack. It's one of the targets by an aggressor state. In a country that's very highly nuclearized and where a big share of electricity mix comes from nuclear, the risks are created not just for facilities in Ukraine, like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that's under physical control of an aggressor, but also for other nuclear power plants that are reliant on this grid for the constant and secure provision of offsite power. So, for instance, one of the most dangerous points in this war was the national blackout in November 2022, when, due to Russian missile attacks, the entire country has gone dark. And all of the emergency backup systems at the other nuclear power plants under Ukrainian control had to kick in. And we know that these are very temporary measures, right? The nuclear power plant cannot run for a long time on these emergency generators. We have also discovered, as Sharon pointed out, that international institutions for the governance of peaceful nuclear uses proved inadequate to this challenge. Partly, not due to any fault to these institutions and tools. It's just an unprecedented situation, and we haven't had the time to design the institutions and tools to be able to respond to it. International law, as Sharon pointed out, does contain a prohibition to not to target with military forces nuclear power plants. But even if Russia were party to this protocol, Protocol 1, I doubt that a determined aggressor like the Russian Federation that has basically violated every international law out there, including, you know, many more provisions of the Geneva Protocol, committed war crimes, alleged war crimes, as far as, you know, we can see right now, would really abide to it. So abide by it. What this war also highlighted is the human dimension of nuclear security. And the more, so nuclear power plants rely to a much greater extent than other kind of bits of critical infrastructure that are also protected by international law, such as dikes and dams and such. Their safe and secure operation of nuclear power plants relies to a very large extent on the licensed, qualified staff, the operators that have to maintain these systems. And in a large-scale conventional conflict, these people become also targets and also victims of the belligerents' actions. So let me turn to some of the kind of military thinking and consequences. So it could be said that the nuclear facilities in Ukraine do offer some deterrence to those who physically control them. So even in the middle of this large-scale war, as Russia has been degrading Ukraine's thermal thermal generating capacity and you know, transmission infrastructure, Russia has abstained from targeting directly, you know, through massive missile barrages, Ukrainian nuclear power plants. I mean, some of them are protected also by air defenses and so forth. But likewise, since Russia has occupied and gained physical control over Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, it has used it as a shield, knowing full well that Ukrainians as a shield to mount attacks on Ukrainian positions, knowing full well that Ukrainians will be deterred from retaliating directly in kind. So using this this facility as a shield. So this, for me, creates an incentive to actually defend nuclear facilities in a large-scale armed conflict, because the physical possession of the facility gives you certain advantages, right? And also for the authorized owner and operator of these facilities, you know, the risks created by a hostile military power taking control over nuclear facility are really drawn out and very unpredictable. So things that happen to the staff, the poor maintenance of the equipment, which they, you know, the hostile state will not have an incentive to follow through and so forth. This brings me to my final point. So where the national security, sort of military strategy, and nuclear security intersect, one of the lessons of Ukraine's war is that it is advisable to disperse your power generating capacity, because big power plants, whether they're nuclear or whatever, when you lose them, that's a big hit on your generating capacity, on your electricity mix. And it's very difficult to balance the grid, right, with the loss of, say, 6 gigawatts of nuclear generating power, generating capacity, that is, for instance, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And it is also, as I discussed, there's an incentive to defend a nuclear facility rather than let it be taken over by a hostile power. What does it mean for a large-scale deployment of SMRs across the territory? So it might be argued that the dispersal is a good thing, right? So you don't have these big juicy targets that are so, you know, when you lose one, you really, that it's a real hit on your grid. At the same time, you know, mounting and organizing a defense of many nuclear facilities dispersed across the country might pose its own challenges. You need extra air defenses for each one of them. They, in terms of siting, they might be sited near large-scale population centers, so that might put the civilians that are living next to them in danger. And also, if there is an accident, then how do you respond across many across a dispersed territory to anything that might happen and any radioactive release that might follow? So with that, I will end and also thank Sharon for starting this really important conversation, because I reiterate, we are only scratching the surface now of what the lessons of Ukraine might be for this large-scale deployment of nuclear power. Thanks.
Alex, do you want to start the question
Absolutely.
session
Yeah.
now? Okay.
Yeah. So reporters on the line, if you wish to ask a question, use the raise your hand function and your line will be unmuted when it is your turn to ask a question. As a reminder, the Q&A period is for reporters only. If you're having any issues with your own audio or the raise your hand function, you may also use the text-based Q&A box. We'll try to get to all of those questions as well. Before we begin, I just want to mention that a video recording of this news event will be made available online later today. That link is in your chat box already. You can also find it at bit.ly/new nuclear security report, along with all of the other materials. All right, why don't we take our first question here? Our first question comes from Jonathan Tyrone at Bloomberg. Jonathan, please unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks, Sharon. Congratulations on the report. Short question. There's about 450 nuclear reactors deployed in the world right now. And to meet any meaningful climate target with SMRs, you're going to have to raise that number of reactors into the thousands, 4,000 being the top estimate I've read. So my question is, SMRs are meant to lower the overnight cost for vendors. That is the amount financed to deploy these things. But it seems practically, given the numbers, it's going to further socialize the cost of security and safety. And I'm wondering if you researched that element, the financial implications of increasing the number of sites that will have to be safeguarded and provided for security and the regulatory regimes, et cetera. And maybe just to Mariana, very briefly, obviously we've been paying attention to the groundbreaking ceremonies, largely symbolic. I'm just wondering, as a message, whether it's Westinghouse or any other vendor, is it the appropriate signal in the middle of a war to show that nuclear is going ahead business as usual and breaking ground on new sites? Thank you.
Let me jump in quickly. Jonathan, thank you for that question. The short answer is no, because it's very hard to predict how this is all going to play out. The best sort of study I know is from the Princeton group, which only looked at the point at which the economy of volume overtakes the economy of scale. So in other words, what they looked at was you're going to have to manufacture, with a 10% learning curve, 700 of these things before they're cost effective. But if it's a 5% learning curve, it's like 60,000. It's like, so you have to get over that first hurdle. Now, of course, governments are going to pay, right? It's not a totally free market, but you're right about the other costs involved. And I think Mariana really put her finger on it. If you are going to have to increase defenses a lot of smaller smaller sites. So maybe that's next year's study. Thank you.
Jonathan, just really briefly, the short answer is no. I suppose that might be a kind of show of resilience, perhaps by the leaders of Ukrainian nuclear industry. But as I discussed, at least from the standpoint of Ukraine grid operator, this is a royally ill-advised idea because you don't want any more concentrated power generation in Ukraine. Not to mention, questions that will be raised about how to finance it, how to ensure all the building codes and materials and everything, and all the appropriate supply chains in the middle of the war. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the question. We will now take our next question from William Freebairn at S&P Global. William, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having this event and inviting us to join. A question for Sharon on the report. I'm trying to understand, it sounds like the main concerns that you have about the risk that this nuclear renaissance 2.0, if we call it that, are that there just are going to be more reactors. Are there so is the specific risk of these new designs of reactors a concern, or is it really, would it be the same if these were all large light water reactors of the type that have been built in the past? Because some of these reactor developers are saying that certain types of fuel, like TRISO fuel, they point to frequently, are inherently more proliferation resistant that would provide some protection. To what degree is your critique really that just nuclear energy should not expand because it will drive these associated risks, or is it the particular new reactor designs that you have concerns about, or both?
You mute.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thanks for the question. It's complicated if you remember that slide with all the different arrows, right? So so much of it depends on where nuclear energy might expand, but also the technical elements. Yes, there are defenses of some of the technologies in terms of proliferation resistance. I would suggest you have to be a little bit careful with that. But once you move into the fast reactor realm, we're not there now, and we understand some of the risks. And if you look at some of the national labs, there have been reports on some of the risks, but it will certainly put out material depending on the fuels that you use, and that pose more proliferation risks. So, even floating reactors, I don't think we even have a handle, not so much on the proliferation end, but on nuclear security. How do you defend a floating reactor? Where is that floating reactor going to be? Is it going to be at the dock? Is it going to be stationed out? Is it on the coast of Indonesia? Is it in the Gulf? So it's when I talk about these potential risks, because obviously a lot of this stuff hasn't even happened. But the key issue, if you've been watching this for the last 20 years, is that all the programs that the US tried to put in place to place restrictions on the kinds of reactors have come to naught. So in the end, when we promote reactors, we are, I would say pretty much saying it doesn't matter. And we won't be able to dictate what kinds of reactors, what technology choices these countries make.
Thanks.
Thank you for your question, William. Stephanie, back to you. Oh, please unmute yourself, Stephanie.
Are we out of time, or?
We're getting close, but we could probably take another question if you.
Okay, well, yeah, I was going to sort of echo Jonathan's question earlier about costs. Has anybody done a study? But I think we've covered that I would like to ask a sort of broadly based question open to all the panelists. And it's this. We spent the better part of a decade under an initiative launched by Obama to repatriate thousands of kilograms of highly enriched uranium and plutonium from various countries that had received them under a previous incarnation of global power competition via research reactor exports. This was in the 50s and 60s under Atoms for Peace, when Russia and the US were going head to head, trying to win influence in countries by giving them, or for a nominal price, or research reactors, and with it, highly enriched uranium fuel. My concern is are we embarked on something even bigger in terms of spreading dangerous fuels around the planet, because now China's involved, and obviously Russia is right out there. And so I'd just like to ask, what's it going to look like 50 years from now, if this really takes off, and any kind of, breeder technology becomes fair game, small or large? Maybe Sharon can start, and then I'd love to hear all three panelists comment on that if we have time.
Criticizing the Atoms for Peace program is sacrosanct in our community. But better or worse. The problem is research reactors actually, some of that highly enriched uranium was very highly enriched. And we did spend billions of dollars and 30 to 40 years trying to get it back. So yes, we've made some mistakes in the past. I think you're right to put your finger on that. It's not just the US and the Soviets now, it's the US, Russians, and Chinese. And the question I think that Jonathan put out there was, if this really takes off and it gets socialized, what happens then? For a long time, the US had a policy of not promoting reprocessing because of the proliferation risks, but you cannot go down the fast reactor route without reprocessing. And I would love to see the US plans for restricting reprocessing to the current technology holders, because I don't think that will be possible. Thanks.
Jane, Mariana, do either of you have comments on this whole issue?
I do not. I mean, it's a little outside my area of expertise, but certainly I think more sort of a proactive thinking from the United States, the US government would be extremely important on all aspects of nuclear safety.
Thank you. Mariana.
Yeah, let me just add that perhaps, the parallels with the Atoms for Peace will not be the exact, in the sense that maybe SMR technology will be more proliferation resistant, and even these higher enriched fuels might be better secured. What I'm concerned about is actually one of the things that Sharon highlighted in her report, is this really long-term dependency. No matter how big or small your reactor is, it's 100-year marriage with whoever supplies the technology, and also kind of guides the buyer through the entire life cycle of the reactor and the fuel. I mean, there's spent fuel issues, there's nuclear waste issues, there's decommissioning the plant issues. And in that, you create sort of these, I think there's a danger of creating these kind of camps, within the global community of, Russian supplied geopolitical interest, Chinese supplied technology, and geopolitical influence pedal through that, and US camp, and so this might have broader geopolitical ramifications in the way this supply structures political allegiances long term.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I hear what you're saying about the technologies being slightly different, but I also heard Sharon say that, you know, if we go down the fast reactor route, we're going to be into reprocessing, and there's always these, you know, lurking dangers. I think we're out of time now, and I'd like to thank Sharon and Jane and Mariana for a very interesting discussion, and to all our attendees and for your questions. But I think that will conclude things. Alex, do you want to take it from here?
Yes, thank you very much, Stephanie. And just to reiterate, in the chat box, we have both the direct report to the link, a direct link, or I'm sorry, a direct link to the report, a direct link to the recording of today's news event, and contact information to speak with any of the speakers that you've heard from today. Again, you can contact Alex Frank at 703-276-3264, and the recording of this news event will be made available here shortly. And as Stephanie said, thank you very much for all of you to join today, and thank you to all the panelists. It was a great discussion. Thank you.